we are publishing the first version of our criminalization index. And this index effectively, ultimately, when it's done in 4 decades, it will look at every single thing in South African law that could give you a criminal record, a criminal fine, or land you in prison. Yet we are not building prisons at this scale that reality justifies. Our prisons are, at the last estimation, about 43% overfilled.
The State of the Nation team is very excited to announce a partnership with Pace Car Rental. Pace Car Rental is one of the fastest growing car rental businesses in South Africa, with branches all over the country. They've got branches in Sandton, Kempton Park, Pretoria, Mhlanga, Gqeberha. Wherever you are, Pace Car Rental is there as well. A bold podcast like the State of the Nation needs a bold partner, and we have found that partner in Pace Car Rental. So why don't you support them? Welcome to the State of the Nation. I'm your host, Mike Sham, and today we're going to tackle a very, very serious topic in South Africa, and that is violent crime. Now, South Africa, we just glibly say that South Africa has a crime problem, but I think it's best understood that the numbers in South Africa are war zone numbers. We have about 25,000 people per annum killed in South Africa. If you consider that South Africa went to the International Criminal Court of Justice to raise a case of genocide against Israel when they had killed 20,000 Palestinians. Yet more people than that are being killed in South Africa every year without it even getting a mention in Parliament. We know that we've got a police minister who's not really motivated to do anything about violent crime, and it's just a matter of time before civil society takes up the case. Now, we do understand that most of the security initiatives are done by the private sector. We've got more private security than we do have policemen, and we've got more people outspoken about crime outside of government than inside of government. In any country, a government would be removed if you had this level of violent crime, but this is South Africa. So we thought that we'd tackle this, and to get us to understand one of the initiatives that's just been started to deal with violent crime is the head of policy from the Free Market Foundation, and that is Martin Van Staden. Martin, welcome to the State of the Nation. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Mike. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so we gave it a bit of an introduction because it's a wildly important topic that we're discussing today. Mm-hmm. Because I saw just numbers that were recently released that in the last 3 months in Gauteng, 1,787 people were murdered in Gauteng, 55 of them children. If you consider that America rioted when one person was killed by a policeman and it was caught on video, in South Africa, I think people don't even bother to video the murders anymore because they'd run out of storage on their phones. It's an absolute crisis. Now, you, together the Free Market Foundation, have started an initiative called Section 12. Yes. Is that correct? Tell us a little bit more about this.
So I think you've already alluded to kind of where like a government would be removed if it allowed in any other context around the world to get crime to get out of control like this. So Section 12 refers to Section 12 of our Constitution, which is titled Freedom and Security of the Person. And really, in our view, that provision encapsulates the basic function of any state institution, of any government anywhere in the world, and that is to protect people's lives and their property. Simple. That's what Section 12 ultimately comes down to. It says all South Africans, in fact everyone in South Africa, has the right to be free from all forms of violence, both public and private. So normal criminal violence and overzealous government violence like we've seen in the past in South Africa. That's Section 12. Government fails on both accounts, and that's why we thought this was a very good place to hang our kind of the FMF's answer to the violent crime problem. And to just briefly say how it fails on both accounts. We have out of control violent crime in South Africa, as you've already said, war zone level violent crime. 86 people murdered every single day in this country, reported murders. 5 people probably all of them women, raped every single hour in this country, reported rapes. So that's probably a far smaller number than what's actually happening. So as far as private violence is concerned, which is government's role, it has failed totally. Criminal justice is not collapsing in South Africa. It has collapsed. It's done. It's over. It's collapsed. On the other hand, public violence. As the government fails to address private crime, it is in basically every law that Parliament adopts, every law that the provincial legislature adopts, there's a provision that criminalizes some kind of conduct, whatever it is. And that just explodes our law full of criminalized activities, which are not violent crimes. These are usually victimless crimes, or things that are better dealt with in the civil law, like the law of delict, where you sue someone for damages and so on. Yet, this explosion in the number of crimes in South Africa, when the government cannot even deal with what we instinctively think about when someone says crime, murder, rape, trespass, destruction of property, etc. Those things government cannot deal with, and instead it is making more crime. So that's where the public violence comes in. People are sitting in our prisons for silly things. There's a bill currently before Parliament that if you smoke or vape in your own house, even if you are alone in your own house, only because you work from home, it's a workplace, you are committing a crime and you could go to jail for that. There are people sitting in prison for stuff like that. So government fails on both accounts. It cannot address private violence, and it itself is a source of violence upon peaceful people who have not really harmed anyone. So crime is violence is a hugely complex issue in South Africa. And the Free Market Foundation, when people think about us, we're an economics think tank, but the fact is we don't have investment in this country. We have people leaving in droves. Number one reason is crime. The economic implications of crime, of violent crime, is huge. So we thought it's time for classical liberals like ourselves, free marketeers, to come forward to the South African public and say, there is an answer, and this is what we have in mind.
Okay, because obviously when it's sometimes the government uses convenient excuses. For example, the whole noise around farm murders, as bad and as brutal as many of them have been, masks the problem if you're focusing on that, which in the scheme of things is a relatively small number compared to the total number of murders, right? The real problem is in poor areas, township areas, rural areas, not necessarily the ones that are getting the headlines. It's not the Bafana football captain getting killed by his girlfriend. This is kind of like we're talking about crime on an industrial level that's obviously happening in far poorer areas than the ones that reach the headlines. Is that right?
Crime is normal.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sick for me to say that, but it's a violent crime. Murder and rape in South Africa is normal. It's ordinary. It's regular. It is just a feature of our society. And this has been said before all around the show, but we have become desensitized to it, and it makes sense given the industrial scale that you've just talked about. Now, I think when it comes to like farm murders or gender-based violence and these kind of specific things, I think there's a usefulness there to getting organizations like AfriForum and so on to say, okay, this is going to be our baby. Let us take care of this. And I think that's hugely kind of productive rather than having a netted approach, which the government should, of course, have. The government must take care of all violent crime, which it simply isn't. But I do think that kind of interest groups will have their pet crimes. A liberal group like the FMF, for instance, would look at the decriminalization of prostitution, or SWET, the Sex Worker Action Force. They look at that, for instance, and crimes against sex workers. So I think there is a usefulness to this, kind of divide the work up for civil society. But what you're saying is completely correct. The astronomical numbers of murders that we're seeing, and I'll mention Cape Town. This is the most violent city in the country. The Cape Flats and Khayelitsha, that's where the industrial scale murder just takes place. People just die in droves there at the hands of others. So that's not a farm murder. That's not necessarily gender-based violence, but it's just normal. And the government treats it as normal. One of the things that we're saying as the FMF is that we're in an election year. And not one political party, not a single political party contesting this election has kind of taken South Africa into its confidence and said, listen, people, we're a pariah. We're effectively an international pariah when it comes to something as simple and as ancient, something that governments have dealt with forever, as murder. We are just not doing it. It's just normal in South Africa, and that's a huge problem at a far higher kind of level of abstraction than anyone is making it seem to be. And what we're saying is, listen, we can't talk really about any other issue, skills development and so on, important as it is, while we have, the proverbial elephant in the room. And that's what we're saying. It's become so normalized, so regularized in South Africa that even during what is being described as my generation's 1994, the most important election of a lifetime, where violent crime isn't even near the top. Load shedding is there, infrastructure is there, corruption, which is a form of crime, but it's not violent crime, is there. Violent crime, murder, rape, it's not there. And that has really kind of blown our minds at the FMF, and we're trying to change the conversation.
Yeah, because obviously violent crime like that has got some terrible knock-on effects, isn't it? It's a morale killer to, if anybody in your family has been violently, if somebody's been murdered or somebody's been raped, these are things that make you reassess everything. It's very bad. It's bad for business, let's put it that way. And, without sort of callously putting a price to it, the country needs to understand what the full impact is of allowing rampant crime. Now, having said that, South Africa is probably the only country in the world where we all know where we could go and get a hitman. They're in fact making a series on Netflix or on SABC about hitmen, right? Because we know you can get a hitman and the price is published. So we all know that if we don't like somebody or we're on the wrong end of a business deal, you sort of go down to the local taxi rank and your problem's gone for 5 or 10 grand. It's unbelievable. It's just obscene, I suppose, is the best way to put it, that South Africa is sitting over there in that situation with some really, really bad company, right? Because, once again, you've got to ask why our legal justice system is very quick to go and condemn 20,000 deaths in a country far, far away, when we got more than that in this country and they seemingly do nothing about it.
Yeah.
So your initiative is to get people to go to your website, which is?
It's section12.org.za.
Right, and register, and then this will hopefully put the issue on the desks of people who can raise it in Parliament or anywhere else with political influence. Is that correct?
Yes, so we're putting forward basically, let's say, 4 solutions that we think are, it's difficult and the political will for that simply isn't there, but we think it's simple enough, and we think that if these things are done, they have a reasonably good chance of cutting violent crime in South Africa in significant levels. Now, you can find that on the website and you can click through and take action. And what happens then is you get to choose out of a list of our most prominent politicians: Cyril Ramaphosa, John Steenhuisen, Ronald Lamola, Minister of Justice, Becky Cele, Minister of Police, and the leaders of our kind of biggest political parties. You send them an email that goes from your email address. So it's not like we're going to send it and within a day we're going to have spam filters blocking us. It's going to come from your email address, but on a letter that we have pre-written, so that it's very low effort to kind of say, listen, minister, listen, leader, this is a workable, viable solution to this catastrophic thing that plagues our society, and take note of it. Obviously, no politician is just going to adopt an FMF kind of policy plan. There's always going to be chopping and changing. But at least take note of it and take from that what kind of would work within the context of your political party. And I'll briefly kind of run through what we're saying. So it's based around 4 Ds. The first one is definition. we need to understand as ordinary South Africans what the extent of criminalization in our country is. So tomorrow, the 13th of March, we are publishing the first version of our criminalization index. And this index effectively, ultimately, when it's done in 4 decades, it will look at every single thing in South African law that could give you a criminal record, a criminal fine, or land you in prison. Every single crime that exists at the national level, the provincial level, the municipal level, and from the courts. We need to define the extent to which our society has been criminalized by government so that we can understand if government's focus is broadly on the right things: violent crime, fraud, destruction of property, etc., destruction of infrastructure, rather than entirely almost focused on what we would say is nonsense, given the context. So definition, we need to understand the extent of our problem. And I think part of that as well is we need to understand why South Africans do have, there's poorer countries than South Africa. That's a reality. There are poorer countries out there with much lower rates of crime. So we need to understand what is it? What is it in South Africa specifically? And I think you and I both have ideas around that, but what is it that leads us to doing this? That's part of definition. Then development. I think this is something that most political parties kind of instinctively understand, and that is that we need to capacitate the police. We need to capacitate prosecutors. The NPA is underfunded. That's a well-known thing in crime discourse in South Africa. A less well-known thing is that we have huge armies of violent criminals in South Africa and other kind of non-serious criminals. Yet we are not building prisons at this scale that reality justifies. Our prisons are, at the last estimation, about 43% overfilled. Now, I don't want to sit here and say that I am someone who has sympathy for violent criminals. But as far as I'm concerned, even murderers shouldn't live in a cell with 40 other murderers and kind of kill each other and rape each other in that cell. We need a prison system that works, where we don't have overfilled prisons. And certainly, crucially, we need to divide violent criminals from non-violent offenders. They shouldn't even be in the same facilities. And I'm not sure that is currently the case. The Free Market Foundation will ask correctional services with a Promotion of Access to Information Act request soon what the state of affairs there is. Are any prisons being built? Who's in which prisons? Are violent and non-violent offenders in the same prisons? Are unconvicted individuals awaiting trial being kept in prison with violent offenders, which would be a tragedy of justice that is relatively unprecedented, and various other things. Why are people in prison for what crimes? We need that information. So that's one part. Of course, the police need more resources. Prosecutors need more resources. Development. The next thing is decentralization. This has been in the news for the last 2 years. Thankfully, it's now a point of discussion in South Africa. We need the devolution and also initiative being taken by lower levels of government. So the SAPS is a huge national institution that has shown, in my view, beyond any doubt, that it is incompetent and it is unfortunately corrupt. I think 50,000 police officers out of 150,000 total have been implicated in some kind of serious crimes, and about only 10% of those have been prosecuted. So our police force is sick. In a very unfortunate sense. So I do not trust them. I think most South Africans, if you ask them, would not trust them. So we need a significant decentralization of policing power in South Africa. That may not be the kind of thing that solves all the problems, but it's part of it. Not only should provinces and municipalities get policing power, but and some people might balk at this suggestion, but private communities and commercial enterprises must also share in combating violent crime. So we have huge vigilantism in South Africa. That's a problem. We need to go into these communities and teach them about due process. They're not going to stop defending themselves. If they think that person is a rapist and that person is not being prosecuted, that community is going to do something about it. And we can cry about that until we are red in our faces. The reality is communities understand that law enforcement isn't working. They are going to do something about it. We need to make sure that if they do something about it, it's in an organized, institutionalized, and hopefully regulated way that is at least somewhat controllable, so that we don't have extrajudicial murders that just add to that number. So that's decentralization. Part of that is private prosecutions. We're very fortunate in South Africa that this thing exists. It's very rare around the world that private individuals can prosecute if the NPA chooses not to. We need to expand that as far as we can and take the pressure off the NPA wherever we can. And then also watching briefs. Lawyers can go to a police detective or to a prosecutor, private lawyers, and can check that they're not losing documents, can check that they're doing their job properly. That also needs to be expanded. So that's decentralization. And then just the last D, which is, I think, the one we feel most passionate about, but the one that we expect to have the most pushback on, and that is decriminalization. We expect at the end of our criminalization index to find that something like 98% of crimes in South Africa are not the crimes that government should be focusing on. The crimes that government should be focusing on has been long recognized by the common law, and I've alluded to them. It's murder, rape, trespass, destruction of property, even treason, sedition, and so on. It's about 20 crimes in total that the government needs to focus basically 99% of its attention on. It's not. It's focusing its attention on hundreds of thousands of other things that we call crimes. Not paying maintenance in South Africa it's terrible. You're a terrible person if you do not pay maintenance. Should it be a criminal offense that puts you in jail and takes up cell space for someone who has committed murder? I'm not sure that it should be. I'm not sure that the government should be focusing on combating those people, terrible people as they are, rather than subjecting that to a civil process where you sue that person, you go through a process, which is also quite punishing. But decriminalization, in our view, the most important thing, because that will focus police resources, hopefully decentralized police resources, on combating real crime. It will focus the NPA's attention on prosecuting real crime. Currently, the NPA has a policy where it simply asks its prosecutors to prosecute. So the incentive there is you prosecute easier crimes, you prosecute quicker crimes, shoplifting, whatethat's essentially a property crime. It should be addressed, but it certainly shouldn't be a priority crime. And long cases, murder, rape, these things tend to go to the back of the line because the NPA does not incentivize prosecutors to focus there. So we need to take as much off the table for the NPA as we possibly can. They shouldn't be able to prosecute someone for smoking in their house. The National Transport Act says that it's a crime to inconvenience a fellow passenger on public transport, on a train or something. Shame. That should not be on the table for the NPA to prosecute, even if it wants to. So we need to clear the decks, clear the table, and only leave those crucially important crimes for the NPA to prosecute. You only achieve that with widespread and deep decriminalization. So those are our 4 Ds. That is the letter that the politicians will find if someone clicks through to our website, ticks who they want the letter to go to, and of course they can read the letter, it's visible, and send it through. And that is, we hope, ultimately going to start a public conversation before the election and after the election, but also register on the radar of the political parties contesting this election so that crime can finally become an issue, an electoral issue in the country with the highest rape and murder rates in the world.
Right. So before we continue, and while I've got somebody from the Free Market Foundation here, it reminds me that this is also a free market show. And we fund ourselves by having some friends become a member of the State of the Nation channel, subscribe. All of these help us to keep the show going. And I want to acknowledge our sponsor of today's episode, Pace Car Rental, who are available throughout the country. And I would recommend anybody, if they are looking to rent a car, bakkies, cars, go to Pace Car Rental. They're around the country because this is a bold podcast and we needed a bold partner, and Pace Car Rental is their partner. So let's not forget about the free market, because I'm going to go back to Martin and I'm going to say that part of the problem we've got severe social problems, and we you know, from our perspective, you are part of the Free Market Foundation and possibly the biggest contributor to our high crime rate in South Africa is our dreadful unemployment crisis. which is as a result of a misfiring economy, badly misfiring economy. And you mentioned, all these crimes that possibly shouldn't be in the hands of the NPA because they're just cluttering up the thing. We've got a similar business problem, don't we, where it's hard to solve unemployment because we've got so much red tape to comply with. I mean, that is the two issues are similar. They sort of occupy a similar space, isn't it? Where instead of running your business, you spend your day filling in forms, and the NPA, instead of prosecuting murderers, they have to prosecute people smoking at home.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it comes down to the nature of the thing.
Yeah.
As a businessman, the nature of your office essentially is to make money, and the more we move around away from that, make money through providing value to the people around you, the more we move away from that to saying, no, but you also have a social obligation, and we have to kind of regulate you to make sure you kind of comply with that, the less you're going to focus on your actual, the nature of what you do. And it's the same for the NPA. Prosecutors have been there to prosecute crimes against people and property. And the more parliament and legislatures, provincial legislatures, and even municipal councils sit down, they're politicians sitting down with legislative drafters, and they're like, Mike, I feel uneasy about people doing this thing. Let's say it shall be an offense. It's in the law, we adopt it, 50% plus one. Suddenly it's the NPA's problem because they have to prosecute that. They don't have to prosecute it. We have a principle of where prosecutors ultimately decide themselves what to prosecute. But when you have a state of affairs, which I think applies largely around the world, but certainly in South Africa as well, where you have a mass of crimes that just aren't being enforced, that leads to a disrespect for the law, because a lot of people feel, oh, good, it's a crime, but nothing's being done. So what now? The law is toothless.
Yeah.
That's the one thing. The other thing is wasting time, and the third thing, which often goes unstated, but it's a huge issue for liberals like myself, is victimization. So writing about the USSR during the Cold War, an American said that, I don't have the specific quote, but effectively you commit crimes just by walking down the street. That's how over-criminalized that society was. And I'm sorry, but it's the same thing here. So I probably committed 10 crimes driving here that I don't even know are criminal. Walking down the street, doing innocuous things might just be, in the eyes of some obscure municipal law, provincial law, national law, a crime. And you can just be the unlucky sod on that day, which has now been identified by whatever government might be in that area, to be victimized, to be made an example of. Now, it's unlikely. It's very unlikely. But the fact is, it can happen, and it shouldn't be able to happen. So you need to kind of clear that also from the range of possibilities. So the NPA should be focusing on it's the thing that gives it its nature. It's a violent institution of state. It is the very core of criminal justice, and it shouldn't be wasting its time on nonsense, and certainly not using that power of the state to victimize. And just on the unemployment question, not only are they similar kind of in how they're structured, but these things feed into each other. Idle hands do the devil's work, and I think once we get to the bottom of what's the biggest contributor in South Africa to violent crime, I think we will find unemployment is high up there. I don't think people who are gainfully employed, even if they are morally suspect and that they would kill people if they could, they simply won't have time. They don't have time to kill people because they're working. And in South Africa, we have, I think it's probably 17 million or maybe a little bit less people who have either are looking for work or aren't looking for work, and they just aren't finding any. It's getting worse. It's getting much worse, and it's probably going to get worse quicker because the government has not started doing the things necessary to cut the unemployment rate, which, again, from the Free Market Foundation's perspective, is to radically deregulate labor, which I must add, there's also a bunch of crimes in the Labor Relations Act and in the Employment Equity Act. For instance, if you keep your business under 50 people, which is when affirmative action starts applying to your business, that's a crime. You could go to jail for that. You could be fined. Okay, no, you can be fined for that. I don't think you can be jailed for that unless you don't pay the fine. Then you can be jailed for that. But even the regulated employment regime, labor regime in South Africa, which is causing the unemployment, in our view, has crimes associated with it, which makes it even more difficult for businesses to do what they need to do to create more jobs. Because now these executives and these boards also think, if we kind of wiggle this thing, I might go to jail. So it's the whole kind of system is perverse, and that's why we really focus on the decriminalization aspect. My colleague Takele Mthembu wrote an article recently asking, where have all the community banks gone in South Africa? I think when you were younger, or when other people were younger, you knew the bank manager, and the bank manager was a thing, and you had local banks and so on that exist and serve a certain community. That's gone now. It doesn't matter who my local Capitec bank manager is, because he can't do anything. He answers to corporate. Where have they gone? Well, one of the reasons is the Banks Act, which currently in our research is the one act with the most crimes in it. I think there's 200 and something crimes in the Banks Act. So you as a small business, you can banish the thought that you could ever start a bank, because you do not want to go to jail if you happen to make a natural mistake. Like the types of things in the Banks Act would be like, if you filled this form in incorrectly, or you supplied inaccurate information to this regulator, that's a crime. You'll go to jail. Of course, there's no community banks. Of course, all the banks in South Africa are these huge institutions with huge compliance departments. So really, these things are all interlinked. The sorry economy, the huge crime rate, and the government kind of posture of not really doing anything to address the issue.
Yeah, I mean, what a lot of people don't know is that, recently we had the passing of the POPIA Act, Protection of Personal Information Act. And in essence, it makes the CEO liable for any breach of privacy laws, which means that you could run a hairdressing salon on the corner, and if your list of clients somehow leaks out, somebody steals your laptop or something like that, you could actually get a 10 million rand fine or go to jail. So it's those kind of laws heaped on the business founder, the person that's going to create that employment, or not, because the risks are just too high. Martin, I wanted to just touch on something else, and I don't know if you've dealt with this, but obviously South Africa has had a violent history. We may not have been involved in many wars in South Africa, as we see in places like Europe and so on, but we have had a very violent past. The one thing that I find quite fascinating is that the violent language hasn't left us. Right? We still have politicians threatening to kill and to shoot, and we just recently had one of the top members of the new MK party threatening to set the country alight and kill people if they're not on the ballot, whether they comply or not. It's that kind of rhetoric that can't be helpful.
No, and we have dealt with it. So last year I think it was early September, we, as the FMF's Rule of Law Project, we were in the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein as an amicus, a friend of the court, in AfriForum's case against Julius Malema on Kill the Boer, his kind of incendiary rhetoric. And our submission there was basically this: politicians need to be held to a higher standard. It's one thing for a Penny Sparrow to say racist stuff, and we should all condemn her, and it's sick. We don't want that in our society anymore. But she is a powerless estate agent who no one heard of before and has heard from since that episode with what she said.
She died, the poor woman.
Yes, anyway, yeah. And I mean, Vicky Momberg is also an example, and John Kolane is also an example. There's many individuals who we as a society should ostracize and say, you're not really helping. But then we have politicians, including the former president, including the leader of the third largest party in parliament, who engage in what we consider to be such unequivocally incendiary pro-violence language. Yet the courts, I don't mean to insult the courts here, but I think that there is a level of hesitancy from the courts in that what happens when the court sends these people to jail. And we keep seeing that. And we went to court and we said, listen, you are applying two standards. Courts, we told the Supreme Court of Appeal, we are very concerned about the fact that the courts are applying two standards. And if there is to be two standards, it has to be reversed. Politicians need to be held to a higher standard, and civilians, normal people, should be held to a significantly lower standard and shouldn't be put in jail for saying ugly things necessarily. Politicians almost certainly should be put in jail for doing that because they command influence at huge scale. And again, like you refer to our history, the command to attack is a powerful thing. And we told the courts, you have it flipped. You are applying a lower standard to politicians. You're saying that, oh no, he said that, it's political rhetoric. You have to, there's a context and kind of be sympathetic to the context. But when a civilian does that, then there's no question of context. It's just like, no, racist, prison, fine, gone. So we have dealt with this, and we find it very, very problematic because we do think that even though this isn't a requirement for hate speech, we do think that there is a link between the rhetoric and the action in practice. Even if it's not a direct link, it is, as you've almost kind of alluded to, it normalizes kind of that violent rhetoric. It makes us, those of us involved in discourse in South Africa, it puts us at a far higher edge. Our discourse isn't diplomatic. Our discourse isn't what you'd expect in a decent kind of well-functioning society. We have a violent discourse where if you don't get your way, then we are going to burn down the country. We're going to make a city ungovernable. And these are all fighting words.
Yes.
When it should be democracy and like you win some, you lose some. But that's not on the table.
And when we see the kind of violence erupting, for example, in the Klean Chamber, where coalition partners are hitting each other, right, quite openly in front of cameras, and nothing happens to it. 300 people got killed in 2021, and a few people on the margins got brought to book. But the people that were saying, let's burn this place down, let's do this, let's do that, nothing ever happened to them. And just the normalization of that speak. Let's not link it only to people who have got the incendiary thing as part of their policy, like the EFF, like MK. But our government is forever talking about war rooms to tackle anything. A war room is not something nice. We shouldn't be talking about war room when it's just a problem to solve. We talk about trains running on time. You don't need a war room. You need a bureaucrat to get the trains running on time. This isn't war.
No.
It's just more a bureaucratic process. So, we certainly need to go out there. Martin, I want to touch on one thing, and that is you mentioned already the kind of legislative pressure because you've got all these crazy things that are illegal, and that takes the eye off the ball of the really serious stuff. There's also the perversion of justice in South Africa. We saw recently the NPA, SARS, everybody bend over backwards to accommodate the president when he did something on Pala Pala that if you or I had to do it, we would go to jail. There is no question about it. Or Edward Kieswetter himself would come and arrest me if I suddenly got a whole packet full of dollars and didn't pay VAT on it at least, or declare it. And he says, it was not a perfected transaction. But there is this perversion of the legal system. Does your initiative deal with that, or do you think that's covered just by all of these excess laws and crazy practices that we've grown so used to?
So that's part of it. But the Section 12 initiative doesn't look at that specifically, but our Rule of Law project certainly does. Because what you've just described, the perversion of the legal system, is nothing more than a very rudimentary violation of the rule of law. What is the rule of law? The rule of law is that governed and governor are bound by the same law. Very simple. It's not the rule of man where you create arbitrary privileges for the political class. We, in a modern democracy, in a constitutional democracy, we bind everyone by the same law. So Even if you're the president, if you break a tax law, you get the same penalty as anyone else. So that's very kind of basically the rule of law. There's other aspects of the rule of law which are far more interesting, but this is this is the entry level stuff. And it's not just a perversion of the legal system, it's just a perversion of law. And Section 1C of our Constitution, this is not often kind of acknowledged, but it says that South Africa is founded upon the supremacy of the Constitution and the rule of law. There is co-equal supremacy in law in our country between the written Constitution that we cite every single day for various purposes and this thing known as the rule of law. We do not treat it as such for what you've just mentioned and what I just said a moment ago about hate speech standards and thresholds. I mean, it's tough. I'm sure it's tough if you're a judge and the president has kind of violated some obvious law and now you're going to send him to jail. But there's a saying in I think it's from the English law, which I like a lot. It's let justice be done, though the heavens may fall. So this is the law. You were bound by tax law, and you're going to jail, Mr. President, and that does disqualify you from still being president. You can't be a criminal and the president at the same time. So yes, I as a high court judge have now single-handedly created a huge constitutional crisis in South Africa, and that's fine, because that's my job. I'm here to make sure that the law is applied fairly and that the rule of law is observed. That is what you get and I'm sure there's no, even the US is having its own kind of issues around similar questions. So it's rare to find this kind of oomph amongst your judicial officers. But that's really the test of whether a judicial officer is a proper officer of the law, is whether he is willing to take that step. I think we have good courts, we have good judges in South Africa on the main. Unfortunately, we're not quite there yet where they really take the rule of law seriously and enforcing it, applying it equally to all. So the FMF is on top of that, but it's not part of Section 12. But please have a look at our Rule of Law project, the website. The chairman is former Judge Rex van Schalkwyk. So we do take that very seriously. We have a whole panel of legal experts who look specifically at these kind of very basic violations of the rule of law.
Okay, so let's just, in closing, just remind people they must go to your website.
section12.org.za, and then you'll see the orange button on every page saying take action. Please read through kind of some of what we say there, the solutions. Click through, endorse kind of what we're doing, and let your preferred politicians know. This is important. Let's put it on the agenda for this election and start taking violent crime seriously in South Africa.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think that this is a great initiative. Regardless of what your view is of the Free Market Foundation, violent crime in South Africa needs to be dealt with. And I think this is a great start. I like the idea of sending letters to inboxes of the people that are actually, we pay them to raise these issues and to protect us. Remember that in a country like, in a democracy like South Africa, it's meant to be that the government has the sole right to violence, and they have given over that right to violent criminals. So let's take it back. Let's go and help this initiative, section12.org.za. I hope you sign up. I'm going to. And to Martin Van Staden, thank you so much for joining us. To everybody that's been with us today, thank you for joining us on the State of the Nation. We'll see you again soon. Pace Car Rental, thank you for sponsoring us, and subscribe to the channel.